All right. Good morning, everyone, or I guess good afternoon. My name is Marcy Breffel, and I am a consultant with Purpose Possible. And welcome to Project Planning for Prospecting and Grants. So, this is part two in our four-part webinar series about all things grants that we are presenting every Thursday at noon in August. So, today we are going to focus explicitly on planning and prospecting. So, we all know that your organizations are doing amazing things in your community, and you're interested in bringing in grant funds to support or even better, expand your work. But do you know how to present your organization and your ideas in a way that will capture funders' interest and get them to write a check? Or do you even know where to look? Today's session is going to explore these topics, and we are going to dive in with two of my other co-consultants, Susan and Rachel. So our run of show today, we'll do some introductions, talk a little bit about setting your strategy and making sure you've got the right infrastructure. We will talk a little bit about project planning and then dive into prospecting for grants and where you go from there with foundation mapping and relationship building. So, like I said, my name is Marcy Breffel. I am a consultant with Purpose Possible. I've been with Purpose Possible for about 2 years, and my work focuses on the arts and culture sector. So, most of my clients are in Metro Atlanta and get to work with these amazing organizations. I'm going to throw it on over to Susan to introduce herself.
Yes, thank you, Marcy. I'm Susan Allison. I've been with Purpose Possible about 3.5 years now as a consultant. I've worked in several, mostly human services nonprofits here in the Atlanta metro before then. And I continue to focus a lot on human services nonprofits, also advocacy organizations.
Hi, I'm Rachel Stanley. I have been with Purpose Possible for just about a year, and I am also Atlanta-based, so have known a lot of the Purpose Possible teammates and clients for some time. I was an in-house fundraiser for many years, so have often been on the other side of the table, wearing many hats and trying to bring in grant funding, working with programmatic staff and all of that. So we are excited to share some of our experience and some tips and tricks with y'all today.
Thanks, ladies. So the first thing that you want to do before you jump into your fundraising search is to understand what your goals are for grants and how that fits into your larger fundraising strategy. So it's important to make sure that your infrastructure is set. So first things first, you want to make sure you set your strategy. So it's important to create visionary goals that indicate how your grants program should grow. These don't have to be measurable per se, but should align with this future vision. So we recommend setting 3+ goals for an 18 to 24-month period. And these could be income goals, like growing your overall grants by 10%. They could be capacity goals, increasing your outreach to new prospective funders, or stewardship goals, which is strengthening your relationships with current or lapsed funders. After you set your goals, it's important to set measurable objectives that will help you reach these goals. So I think many of us have heard of SMART objectives or SMARTY objectives. These are strategic, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, and inclusive and equitable objectives. Ooh, it's a mouthful. But these will help you accomplish what you want to do and help guide your selection of grant opportunities. You may be wondering why we're thinking 18 to 24 months. Well, this will give you a long runway to execute your objectives. As grant writers, Susan, Rachel, and I know how much time it takes to plan, write grants, submit, wait for notification, which is sometimes the hardest part, and then receive that award. Some federal funders take 6 months or more to notify their grantees. Other funders may only do one cycle a year. So pushing your time frame out from 12 months will help you plan long term. It's also important to conduct a needs assessment to best understand where the gaps and priorities are in your organization. How can grant funding address these needs? Next slide. So another part of this infrastructure is having clearly defined policies that will ensure your grants program has integrity and transparency. These policies don't have to be long, but they need to provide clarity. And this is an opportunity for you to involve your board. They are the ones that set internal policies. This doesn't need to land on staff. So a couple of examples of policies. The first one is a grant proposal approval policy. So it's important to know who is going to sign off on grant proposals. What grant proposals may require approval? And are there any funders that are completely off the table? For example, if you are a nonprofit working for climate change, you probably don't want to go after big oil and gas companies for some of those corporate money. The next one we want to think about is an acceptance policy. So do you have the programmatic and administrative capacity to carry out and report on these grants? Do you know what you're promising in your applications? So this policy ensures that leaderships know all about the tasks a grant award may require. Nobody wants to be on the end of that where you're doing some final reporting and you realize you haven't done something that you promised in a grant application. You also want to set a recognition policy. So who sends the acknowledgement letter? Do you need to have a signed grant agreement for every single grant for your audit? This adopting a recognition policy for swift action will really help you out when you receive an award. And then finally, it's very helpful to have a financial review policy. If you don't already have one, now is the time to create one. So many grants will require some sort of financial audit or financial review. So have these in place, and this will really help you in the long run. So a couple of tips, make sure to include a timestamp on these policies so you know when they were created and when you need to update them. And then keep them in a place where everyone can find them. This especially helps if you had a lot of turnover in your development department. I think, Rachel, did you think you had that experience with some federal grants?
Yes. And speaking of turnover, one thing I would really caution folks to be mindful about is the grant proposal approval process. I've seen, many a grant writer or development director want to craft a proposal with really high impressive deliverables. They've, saying they're going to serve a huge number of clients each year due to this funding. And if that's a federal grant or, another type of funder who has very detailed reporting, they are going to ask about that. And so if your internal team is not aligned on how many people they can serve with X amount of funding in X time period, you will find yourself in an unpleasant situation when it comes time to report. So even though that sort of strategy of proposing really high deliverables, is coming from a good place, it's so important to stay realistic and make sure everyone is on the same page, in the development department, or if you're, an executive director or, maybe one of one or two staff members at your organization. It can be really tempting to, just write what you think is the most impressive proposal possible, but especially if you won't be the person delivering those services yourself, then it can be easy to get a little overly optimistic. So that's one example I've seen too many times of the internal team not being on the same page before you present the proposal to the funder and say, hey, here's what we can do. So, obtaining funding can often have an urgency about it. But, by taking a little bit more time and asking a few more questions internally on the front end, you will actually save yourself and your organization quite a few headaches on the back end. So that's definitely a big lesson I would recommend.
Absolutely. Having all of these infrastructures in place will make everybody happy. You as the grant writer, your leadership, your staff, and your funders. And once you have this infrastructure in place, then you can start with program planning and prospecting. And I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Yes, the important thing that Rachel just brought up and that we'll talk about throughout is that you are not alone as a grant writer in preparing these proposals. It does require you to work and get input from everyone in your organization in some cases, but definitely those that are responsible for managing the programs. So it's good to always develop a good working relationship with the people in those departments. The program planning includes how you're going to tell your story. And of course, this webinar is about things that need to be completed before you actually start writing grants. So that is another thing that you will want to communicate with everyone that's working on that project. The who, obviously the target population for your programs, who will be managing and administering the program. That is information that you'll want to have. And I know of several funders that also ask for information about those people and their qualifications. So that is information that you'll want to go ahead and get up front in addition to your partners and collaborators. Another very common question when it gets to the actual grant application. The what is including the community needs and your goals. It is important in that area. You'll be developing the boilerplate, the narrative that we'll talk about in a bit. But it is important to remember people outside your organization, outside your particular specialty, will not understand necessarily the community needs. On occasion, if I'm starting with a new program, I, as appropriate, will have someone outside the organization read what I have written, because we're very caught up in nonprofits and our mission and our acronyms and our jargon, and we may not think about the fact that we're not being clear to someone outside the organization. We've talked about in the previous slides the specific objectives. That includes how you will measure those and why those are important, in addition to the resources and the costs. And if you're a small nonprofit, I do encourage you to, whether it's a board member or an accounting firm, that you will need someone, if you don't have that background, to assist you with the financial end of the planning. You'll also need a timeline for implementation. Want to give attention to the specific geographic area you're serving. And then again, the what leads to the why. How does this improve the problem or the mission that you have stated? And how does the funders that you're looking for would need to align with what you're doing? Next slide, please. The priorities are something that you'll really, again, want to talk with your colleagues about. What are your current financial needs? If your organization is struggling a bit to reach the general operating budget that you have approved for the year, that might not be the time to consider launching a new program. And that's something that everyone in the organization will need to be involved with that decision. There are a lot of foundations now, thankfully, that have been in conversation with people in the community and realize that general operating funds are needed. So if the foundation is open to that, I suggest that you take a look at that as a viable option. New program funding. One thing that I constantly remind program managers and executive directors is if you're planning to launch a new program, I, as the grant writer, do need advance notice. I'm working with a couple of foundations right now that are probably going to make an announcement in 7 or 8 months or more after the application. So advance notice on even an anticipated possible program is very needed when we do our planning. Mission alignment, you might have heard the term mission creep. Sometimes you have, there tends to be trends and what foundations want to give to, and could be that there'll be a lot of money in a certain area. It can be tempting to look at those funds, but if you have your mission and you know what your population needs and you have made plans around that, be careful about looking at funding for something that is really outside of your current area. Capacity is, I think, particularly important in reporting. Rachel mentioned federal grants. If you look at any type of government funding, especially federal, they will give you an idea of what reporting they require, the financial reporting, the metrics, the paperwork, and so on. We'll want to look at that part of the application to make sure that your staff has the ability to do that. Otherwise, that grant will not work out well for you. Reporting is required. And then be intentional, take your time, review the opportunities. There are always going to be more foundations than you're able to apply for. People will suggest ones to you, but you do need to look at those that are best suited for your organization. Next slide, please. A dashboard of some kind, I strongly recommend. It can be a spreadsheet, it can be whatever your preference is, but something that helps you plan ahead and track, and also take a look at the likelihood of funding. And likelihood can have many factors. This is just a best estimate on your part, but it helps you use your time wisely. One thing that might make it a higher probability is if you, a board member, someone has a connection with the foundation. Could be a corporate foundation or a family foundation, for example. Take a look at their funding focus. I will sometimes hear people say that, well, we only intend to go after the larger grants, and I understand that. However, if there are funders, family foundations possibly, that give a moderate amount, but on your end, their only requirement is that you keep them apprised of your work, then I would say continue to value those funders and keep them on your list. Typically, you have a wide variety of annual payouts. On the other hand, if it's a fairly small grant, but the reporting process is very complicated and takes a long time, that may not be something you want to spend your time on. So that's something you'll want to look at very carefully when you're planning the actual applications you'll be submitting. Next slide, please.
Alrighty, on to the portion of this presentation that I know I get asked about quite a bit, even anecdotally. You know, I could be talking to someone at the coffee shop, they hear, you know, that I'm involved in nonprofit fundraising and grant writing. They want to know, where are the grants? Where can I learn about them? Do I need to buy that really expensive subscription? How do you learn about opportunities? So we're going to tell you, not in a magic bullet sort of way, but our sort of best tips and tricks to find out about potential grant opportunities and potential funders. So number one, funder websites. When they exist, they are often very helpful. So, of course, if you know of a funder, maybe you've just heard their name, maybe they used to fund your organization, maybe they fund peer organizations of yours. Definitely check if they have a website. And even if you haven't worked with them in a while and maybe they didn't have a website, a lot of things have changed, especially since the COVID pandemic. So give them a Google and see if they do have a website. I would caution you, be careful and make sure you're looking at the correct foundation. I know there is a major funder here in Atlanta that that is quite philanthropic, does a lot in the funding space. And I Googled them one day and I thought, they have a website, finally. How wonderful. They're here. They're on the internet. And then I scrolled to the bottom of the page and looked at their address and saw that this foundation had a very similar name, but was based in a state on the other side of the country. So things like that, especially, many foundations have fairly broad names, just a family name. So double check you're looking at the right foundation. But if they do have a website, that is really wonderful. I think more and more funders are realizing that if they put a little bit of information on their website, like some of these examples that we pulled on the right side of the screen here, and tell nonprofits, when and how they accept applications and what their funding priorities are, it hopefully can cut down on some confusion and wasted time for both sides. So if a funder has a website with some information, that is ideal, but of course, many foundations still do not. But this is only the beginning of our search for funders. 990s does not sound very fun or very fruitful, but it really can be. So 990s are a piece of tax paperwork that foundations, nonprofits, etc., have to file every year, and they are public information, so you should be able to find them. There is always going to be a delay, of course, from when the organization's fiscal year ends to when they file their tax form to when it gets processed and uploaded. So, you won't, through looking at 990s, you won't be able to see who a foundation funded last month. But it's still helpful information. And of course, many foundation priorities and even organizations they fund do often stay the same year to year. So 990s aren't up to the minute information, but they're still quite helpful, especially because they are public information. So when I'm looking for a 990, I often just Google the funder name 990. You can often go to a couple of sites that tend to aggregate them for exactly this purpose, such as GuideStar or ProPublica. And sometimes you have to create an account with the website, a free account, but just create a little login, username and password, and then you can look at 990s to your heart's delight. And we're going to pull up a couple of 990 examples, actually, because they can be pretty long documents and they have a lot of numbers on them. They have small text, so it can be really intimidating. But you don't have to be an accountant or have any kind of financial background to get a few key tidbits of information from a 990. So we're going to look at just two examples of 990s. And the form will always be the same, but of course the exact information in it will vary. And some of that is because just foundations and organizations, they vary in their operations a little bit. Some have paid staff, some don't. Some are have a lot of assets in stocks and bonds and just have different information that they have to report to the IRS based on their setup. But we're going to show you sort of a few quick things that we like to look for. And the nice thing with 990s too is that all foundations will have one. And of course, not all foundations have websites. So by Googling or going to a website like GuideStar, you can pull up the 990 that you're looking for, and it will have the name of the foundation at the top, albeit in very small letters. And it will have a little contact information up here at the top, but I'm going to show you an even more helpful place to look. And these documents overall can be quite long, but don't get intimidated by that. And we are just going to look through the really top line version here. Well, you could spend quite a while looking at 990s. So if you scroll down past a lot of small font, some 990s will have this section, part 7, that lists officers, directors, trustees. So these are people that will tell you their title here as well. These are generally the foundation's board of directors or some similar role. And this is really helpful in trying to figure out if you or your organization has a relationship with anyone at the foundation. For family foundations, these are often family members, maybe, one generation and the next generation. It might be paid staff. In this particular case, they have a professional company helping them out with some of the management. For these folks at this foundation, they just have their foundation source listed as their contact information, but I would definitely recommend checking this section on each 990 because you never know how much information it will have, but it's often one of the most useful sections of a 990. And then we will keep scrolling down. It's a lot of scrolling, but it's worth it. So down in this section, I'm on page 11 of this particular 990. They will have this section that lists if the foundation accepts unsolicited proposals and sort of how and whom they accept requests from. So oftentimes on the 990, if this box is checked here in the middle of the page, that means that they already have organizations in mind that they fund and generally don't accept unsolicited requests. I wouldn't say that's black and white, but if that box is checked, that at least lets you know it's unlikely that they are going to fund new requests. But also this section has a few different places for contact information. So not only here are they listing a particular person who can help answer questions about this funder, even with a phone number, which is pretty nice. And this foundation also has a website. We're not going to do too deep of a dive, but just by scrolling down, we already found so much contact information for them. And then I know on their website, as opposed to trying to squeeze it into these small fields on this IRS form, on their website, they do have more information about deadlines, areas that they fund, etc. So far, really worth the time to scroll. And then last but not least, many funders will list, in this tax year that their 990 is covering, who exactly they gave grants to. So as you can see through the preview here, this is quite a long list for this particular foundation. And they are listing nonprofits and their address, a short little description on what the grant was for, and then the grant amount. So this is really helpful for seeing what kinds of organizations they fund, where the organizations are. If you look at one or two 990s from a foundation and every single grant is going to an organization in Colorado and you are based in North Carolina, that's probably not going to be a great use of your time, getting them to try to change up their practice. And the other thing that's really helpful here is looking at the amount of the grants. So particularly if your organization hasn't engaged with this funder before, you can see sort of the typical levels that they fund, or sort of the lowest and highest levels that they tend to fund at, and place yourself within this range of a funding amount that the foundation tends to do, so that you're not presenting them with an ask that is just night and day different from what they typically do. And this 990 is very detailed. They're funding a lot of nonprofits, and they're providing all the information here on their 990, which is so helpful. Y'all can see I'm not even halfway through the document, so there's a lot to play around with here. So that's an example of sort of a detail-heavy, pretty useful 990. And then I wanted to show y'all one other one. And, my background is certainly not in finance. This is not any sort of tax or financial advice. But funders are not required to publicly release all of their 990. Some sections they are, but some sections they can retract. So you will just see some 990s that just don't provide as much public information. This one that we're looking at now, it still has a decent amount of information, some contact information, but you'll see it looks a lot different and is a lot shorter than the previous 990 we're looking at. So you still have contact information right up here at the top of the form, provides a name, mailing address, phone number, which is pretty helpful. Especially in making sure you're looking at the foundation you think you're looking at. And then if we scroll down a little bit, keep scrolling. Hopefully no one's getting dizzy. So here we're in the officers and trustees section, same section that we were looking at on the previous 990, but you can see that it just says see attached. We don't know how many people are involved in this funder, who they are, and what kind of roles they have. And then with a little more scrolling. Okay, they have a little information here in the section. They say they do accept unsolicited requests for funds, which, gives you a little hope. And they provide a little more contact information, including an email, which is very nice. And then you can see that they say, see attached for giving guidelines and mission statement. So they are saying there's a lot of information on a perhaps attached document. And same thing with the list of grantees. We see that they paid out, almost $25 million worth of grants in this one tax year, but they're saying see attached for who exactly all those grants went to. And if we keep scrolling, spoiler alert, you will see not much. So they, just on this public version of their 990, they did not include, nearly the amount of detail as the other 990 did. And you'll just see a range of 990s. So because they're all out there on the internet, they're free to access, they're definitely worth looking for. And you can always search the document, using Control F or a text search function to find what you're looking for fairly quickly. But 990s really do vary. And, the very cheesy cliche of when one foundation, one foundation really still holds true. We're giving you some tips and tricks, but there's not one solution that's going to work for all foundations or all funders, unfortunately. But definitely recommend taking a look at 990s. Alrighty. Online databases is something that I know comes up a lot for us at Purpose Possible, and we get a lot of questions about as well, because there are different sorts of directories, and a lot of them have been marketing more and more and trying to convince you that they are a great resource that you need. So there's quite a few private grants databases like Instrumental, Foundation Center, Grant Gopher, and a lot of these databases have free trials, so that's a great way to really get in the system, see what kind of search functionality it has, see if you like it, see if if you're looking for a database that lets multiple members of your team use it at once. Is that the sort of capability this system has? So if you can get a free trial, that's always a great way to go. Also, we will, for everyone who registered for this webinar, we will be sending out these slides afterwards. So you don't have to take detailed notes if you don't want to. With some of these databases, like Foundation Center, specifically, most public libraries do have access to it. So you might have to go into the public library, but there's often some workarounds like that to get at least some sort of access to them for free. So regardless of the size of your organization's budget, I would look into sort of the lowest cost investment, including potentially no investment, to look through some of these databases. Grants.gov is all federal grants. So it has a lot of grants, which is wonderful, but it is very information heavy, sort of challenging to read. You can set up email alerts on particular topics or particular agencies, but that is very information heavy, and I would say probably not the most beginner friendly one. Some more user friendly sort of databases and lists include your state nonprofit associations. We're all based here in Georgia. The Georgia Center for Nonprofits has a list of grants on their website, as well as the ongoing email that sends out some more grant opportunities. So that's very helpful. And then you may also want to look at your local community foundation. So here in Atlanta, we have the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta. There are also community foundations like the Community Foundation of Northeast Georgia, which is just about an hour up the road. So particularly if you're just getting started, look around at other people in the nonprofit and philanthropic spaces to see what resources are already out there and who's sort of doing research and aggregating it into one place that you may be able to take a look at. Alrighty. Peer organizations are also a resource that I know we utilize and recommend quite a bit. So whether it's, an organization maybe you have a programmatic partnership with, or an organization that, clients always confuse you for, or, a family member always asks you if that's the one you work at, it's definitely worth the time to take a look at their websites, annual reports, social media, donor wall, if they have one in their building, and just see who is funding them. A lot of these resources, are done sort of in the sake of marketing and thanking the funders, but it's a list right there, accessible for you to see who is funding similar organizations. So I would definitely recommend taking some time to look at organizations that offer similar services to you in your area, and maybe even, across the state or across the country, to get some ideas of specific funders, but also potentially of sectors or types of funders to look at. And again, this is a resource that is 100% free, so why not take a look at it? Alrighty, and then we have industry organizations and publications. Of course, there are several, in the nonprofit fundraising sector, such as the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Philanthropy News Digest. There's, many we didn't list, but many of these organizations, whether on their social media or their email lists, will list specific grant opportunities, or may even profile a funder, and you can learn about their interests that way, and then try to follow up on, with them individually to try to start the relationship. Purpose Possible does put out similar resources as well. So I would definitely recommend going to our website, purposepossible.com, to look through some resources on our website, as well as some emails that we send out on a regular basis with opportunities that we keep an eye on. And then last but not least is sector-specific resources. So whether you're in education or environmental causes, animal groups, we put some arts examples here. These are different kind of arts organizations that happen to be funders themselves, but also work with the community and are very well connected. So any sort of leader in a particular sector that's also involved in philanthropy in some way is often good to keep an eye on and keep in touch with, to try to make sure that you're finding as many opportunities as possible. And again, these are typically free resources. So, you may get to the point where you do decide that you want to pay for a grants database. We've seen that many times as well, and it may make sense. But there are also many resources that are just sitting out there on the internet for free. So we wanted to alert you to some of those. And Susan has some other ideas for us as well to get very creative.
Yeah, being creative is very important in seeking out funders for sure. And we mentioned the industry-specific groups. Another reason to be involved in those is that you obviously make contacts that can often help you in your work. But I've seen so many people be, just so generous if they see something that a fund opportunity that isn't for their organization, they will forward it to other people to make sure that they are aware. So those can be very, very helpful, those keeping involved in your industry. I was working for a time with some nonprofits in the agriculture area, and they were constantly getting information from their peers in other states about funding opportunities, which was very helpful. Another thing that has worked for me is not only, and we'll talk about board connections in just a moment, that's obviously very important, making contacts with funders, but I've also in conversations with other staff members, whether or not that person is involved with the program or the fundraising department, that they may have a connection with a company that is very generous and gives grants and can provide an introduction. The people who are the beneficiaries of your nonprofit services can give recommendations along those lines. Another method I like to use is just sort of draw a map of the organization and who it touches in your community. If you are doing workforce development, job training, are there companies that are hiring your graduates? Those are people who are benefiting. If you have an organization providing childcare, it may be benefiting employees of some nearby companies. So these are the kinds of things that you keep in mind and really do require some creative thinking on the behalf of the people that are doing fundraising in general and grant writing in particular. So.
Absolutely. And Marcy's going to go through a technique that we like to use quite a bit, especially for those foundations who may not have a lot of information about them online, or who say they don't accept unsolicited proposals, or who just are a bit of a mystery to your organization.
All right. Thanks, Rachel. So before we jump into this, just one short anecdote. Sometimes with prospecting, you are going to use, we've shown you a couple different categories, but sometimes you're using all of them in your search with a funder. I got started with a client in Metro Atlanta who works, one of their pillars is historic preservation. And I started looking for prospects for them, and I used Foundation Directory and was able to identify a funder who in Georgia who funded historic preservation. I pulled their 990 because they didn't have a website, and was able to look at organizations they had funded in the past. And one of these I recognized, that was a museum in Thomasville, Georgia, that I just happen to have a friend who works there. And I was able to call her up and ask to speak to their executive director, who then just gave me the 411 on this funder. And unfortunately, this funder, although they were still funding historic preservation, they were only doing it in South Georgia. So was able to disqualify them and not waste a ton of time, doing outreach, since we knew that they had a very, very focused giving strategy. So just again, you'll use a number of these different prospect strategies in your work. But one thing that we want to focus on is foundation mapping. And this is a strong tactic to use with funders who don't accept unsolicited proposals. Maybe they don't have a website. Maybe they don't provide a ton of information about their processes. But this is a great way to engage your board members, which should be in one of an organization's biggest assets. Someone joins your board because they believe in your mission, or they should join your board because they believe in your mission and they're willing to do whatever it takes for your organization to succeed. So with foundation mapping, it's key to know who the decision makers are. Very helpful to you in my dashboards that I use for different clients. I always include columns on my prospects tab, and there's a column for staff contacts and then a column for all of those trustees for the foundation, which at this point you've maybe already found through their 990 or through their foundation website. So it's important to know who those decision makers are. It usually is not staff, but staff can be helpful. And, the trend that we're seeing now is these next generation board members are now coming into a foundation. So whether they be family foundations, where maybe it's the grandkids who are onboarding as trustees, it's important to understand who the decision makers are going to be, and make sure you're doing your research so that you fully understand their funder priorities. It's also helpful to check to see how foundations want to communicate. So sometimes on websites, we're seeing more and more where a foundation might say, hey, before you even submit an LOI to us, a letter of inquiry, we want you to reach out to us and set a meeting so that we can talk one-on-one and really make sure that this is the best, alignment between the foundation and your organization before you get started on this long process of applying. Or you might also see on a foundation's website, they might say, hey, you can try to ask us for a meeting, but that's not going to necessarily impact, decision-making with applications. So look to see if a foundation is open to one-on-one meetings. We're also seeing a trend now where, at least in some of the Metro Atlanta foundations, where some of these foundations are hosting quarterly meetings or monthly roundtables, where it gives them the opportunity to bring together a small group, maybe 10 or 12 different organizations, and to meet with a foundation representative to talk through their different opportunities where there's alignment. So we're seeing that with foundations like the Goizueta Foundation, Dobbs Foundation, and Truist. So after you've done your prospecting, it's important to identify your method for mapping. So how are you going to put these foundations in front of your board members or your staff or your volunteers, other interested parties, to see where the connections are? So I personally like to use a Google form. And this is something that I learned from another Purpose Possible consultant. You can see on the right, I have an example of a Google form that I've used before or at least part of it. And so what I do is after I've done prospecting and I go to maybe a board meeting and I explain to the board members why we're prospecting and what their role is or can be in helping to make these connections with different foundations. So do the explanation first, and then I like to have a Google form that I send out to all the board members, and I ask them to complete it, within a couple of weeks. You want to have a deadline so you can stay on your plan. But what I'll do is I will include a list of the foundations that we are wanting to reach out to. If they have a website, a list of their staff and board. I'll try to link to that. For example, you can see on here, the Toll Foundation is an example. So I've connected to their website, and then I've pulled all of their trustees and staff members. And so your board members, what they can do is they can just scroll through this Google form and just click who they know. And we put a caveat up at the top that says, by clicking this person, you are committing to sending an email. And that's all that we ask of board members, is to just send an email. I always like to include an option of that, I don't know anyone at this foundation. And to be honest, that's the most common answer you're going to get when you do this type of foundation mapping. So once you've done your mapping, you want to create sample language for your introductory emails. So this is sample language that you can send out to your board or your staff or your volunteers and just ask them to say, hey, all we need you to do is take this language and send it to your contact at this foundation. That's all they got to do is make a connection. And you want to make sure that you're creating space in this email for that board member, the author of the email, to emphasize their personal connection. So if Rachel knows someone at the Toll Foundation, I'll give Rachel some language, and then she can say, hello, contact, and use that intro language and then make it her own. And what she'll be doing in that email is just making a connection. So after you also want to make sure that you're tracking your connection and outreach. So you want to include a column in your tracker that states which board member holds the relationship with that particular foundation and maybe where you are in the outreach process. Okay. And then when you do meet with a foundation, you want to ask a couple different questions. And we're going to talk about that on the next slide, relationship mapping. All right. So with relationship building, again, you want to make sure you have a game plan for funder outreach to build that relationship before you apply. So it's very important to have maybe a short summary of your proposal, maybe a 1 to 3 sentence paragraph answering that who, what, when, where, and why. And this is what Susan went over earlier. Relationship building, it's also important to engage in those networking events and conferences where funders are present. This provides an opportunity for face-to-face engagement, allowing you to introduce your organization and establish a personal connection. So once your board member has sent that email, just making the connection between this foundation trustee and usually your executive director or maybe the director of development, then it's time to request an introductory meeting. So you want to use your time wisely. It's helpful to ask for a phone call or maybe a Zoom call for this first connection. You likely won't want to introduce a site visit or ask for a site visit on your very first introductory email. And it's important in that introductory meeting to ask thoughtful questions, listen to the foundation rep's insight, and think about how your work aligns with their priorities. You can also ask this foundation, who else should we be talking to about a particular program? Or is there anything you think we need to address to better our proposal? Maybe what's the typical amount for a first-time grant? These are all really important questions to ask during either your introductory meeting or subsequent meetings. You also want to keep funders informed about your organization's progress and successes. So you can do this by sending annual reports, update emails, maybe invitations to major events or programs. All of these acts will help you steward that relationship. And then it's also important to express gratitude and acknowledge their support. If a funder has provided support, always follow up with a thank you note or personalized acknowledgement. By demonstrating this appreciation and recognizing their contribution, this is going to foster goodwill and strengthen that relationship over time. And the last thing is to don't treat people like an ATM. So the goal here is in relationship building, it's givers, not gifts. You want to think of these funders as partners in your work. So maybe instead of just asking about funding, really focusing on how to build a strong relationship. Do you have the information, resources, reports that a funder could learn from? Can you send them an event invitation? So we want to really build that strong partnership so we can sustain the relationship over time and hopefully get, if they become big fans of yours, that hopefully will help you get those gifts year after year. All right. Whew. It's a lot of information. We are just a few minutes short of our 1 p.m. end, but again, want to share that this is just part 2 in a 4-part webinar series. Next week, Andrew and Caroline and Mary Ellen are going to address best practices for polished prospects proposals. So really diving deep into the content of an application and the leading practices. And then on August 29th, Andrew, myself, and Trisha will be looking at grants management and stewardship. So we hope that you will tune in for the rest of the series. Again, you can scan these QR codes, which I think we've also dropped into the comments section. So to learn more about Purpose Possible and the work that we do, and to also check out our very beautiful 2023 annual report to hear more about the work that our clients are doing, how we're supporting them, and their testimonials. And jump over to the last one. If you have any questions, here are email addresses for myself, Susan, and Rachel. And I think, see if we have any comments. I don't think we do, but I'll throw it over to the group. Maybe just any last, for Susan and Rachel, any last tip or tips for attendees? Something that you'd like to share?
I will second what Catherine is saying in her comment there, that being a part of professional associations is really key. And it's something that you may not feel that you have time for, but it does help immensely. And I also know that those that are new to grant writing might be hearing this and realizing how much work there is to do before you actually write a grant proposal. And that is true. This is all necessary prep. But we'll be going into the actual writing of the grant proposal in the future webinars. So we look forward to that.
Absolutely. Grants can be a big lift, but you're not alone. Whether it's a professional association, some of the resources we shared, or if a consultant is right for your organization. And it's a process, despite pressure you may be receiving from various sources, it's a process. It takes time. Not everything will be done in one day. So take a breath and it will be okay.
And I would say that while you're looking at funders, make sure those funders can find you. Make sure your website and your social media clearly articulate your work and impact. So you want to show how your organization is showing up in professional networks and how you are represented by the local media, because it's a two-way street. While you're looking for funders, they are looking for organizations that will help move their mission forward. All right. Thanks, y'all, so much. We appreciate you joining us today, and we will see you next week for proposals. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.